Thank you for being here, to all of you after lunch, and thank you very much to the organizers for all your efforts to put together this wonderful program and allowing all these stimulating discussions. So it's a real pleasure to be here and to present my work, which is, so you will see immediately, I'm not coming from art history, but really from media history. So my talk is maybe a little bit on the margins, but at the same time, I think it really will resonate very much, at least with Brooke's talk after mine. So, and yeah, I will start immediately on the moon, with the moon landing, an event that would not have been possible without technologies of ubiquity. On July 20th, 1969, the first man walked on the surface of the moon. This event, made possible by the NASA-led Apollo 11 mission, took place nearly 400,000 kilometers from Earth. Thanks to a small black and white television camera and an international satellite communications network, it was watched live by more than 500 million viewers, half of all television viewers at the time. The blurry and not always high contrast images of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin existed on television screens around the world. For the first time in history, the planetary scale of television produced the visible proof of man's colonization of outer space. In his analysis of the moon landing, which he describes as the supreme television event, media theorist Lorenz Engel emphasizes the radical expansion that television has operated at the occasion of this televisual event, and that includes the spatial expansion of the television signal that traveled from the moon to the Earth, as well as the quantitative expansion in terms of audience numbers. Yet, for Engel, television's importance for the moon landing is first and foremost related to its, what he calls, ontographic nature. Contrary to film or photography, for Engel, television does not produce a recorded image of an event, but continuously writes the event in form of picture elements and lines on the TV screen. The television signal appears for a short moment on the screen surface to be erased again. Therefore, according to Engel, in television, the distinction between something like an external reality and its representation becomes uneasy at least. On TV, reality is embedded within its electronic signal. For the moon landing, the convergence of the event and its image becomes a central feature of the mission, since live television images provided the visible and immediate proof of the conquest of the moon. As writes Engel, the generation of evidence in the live image was both the purpose of the mission and its prerequisite. In short, the moon landing was not only a pivotal moment in the Cold War space race, but also in the history of TV. The moon landing was a mise en scène of television and its affordances. The spectacularization of space went hand in hand with the celebration of the mass media. Engel's analysis of the moon landing is stimulating for our discussion today, as he defines television as a technology of ubiquity that not only gives access to outer space, but co-constructs outer space existence back here on Earth. Yet, as actually most television scholars, Engel overlooks alternative configurations of television in space that were not based on the broadcasting model. Indeed, television as a technology of remote seeing with a planetary outreach was not only visible on the TV screens in living rooms around the world, but also on the monitors of NASA experts, where it served the planning, preparation, and execution of space missions since the early 1960s. These televisual configurations were related to instrumental uses of television and TV as a useful media. They produced particular regimes of visibility and visual evidence which sustained the institutional, scientific, and political goals of the US Space Agency. And today I would like to briefly discuss 3 televisual configurations used by the NASA during the 1960s that represent 3 ways to conceptualize seeing at a distance in the context of outer space.
These three assemblages are television as surveillance, television as simulation, and TV as data. And of course, I won't have the time to give you really a detailed overview. My goal is rather to highlight the multidimensional operability, so the various uses of television as a tool in the Cold War space race. And I start my discussion here at the center, which is actually the start of any Apollo mission, that is the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, from where the Saturn rocket that brought the astronauts into space was launched. The Kennedy Space Center was organized around an extended geography comprising an assembly building where the Saturn rocket was built and assembled, a control room from where the launch was overseen, and the actual launch pad from where the rocket started. The launch pad was some 5 kilometers away from the control room, so the distance between NASA's scientists and engineers and the launch site was about the same distance as the distance that separates us here from the Eiffel Tower. That's according to Google Maps. But just to give you an idea. So there is an extended geography. This extended geography was made necessary by the dangerous nature of the launch itself. It required a remote link between the center of the action, the launch pad, and the responsible teams in the control room. This remote link was provided by 65 TV cameras installed at key points around the site. Thanks to a sophisticated closed-circuit television system, television gave access to what remained inaccessible to the NASA teams. CCTV cameras were placed on the launch tower, for example, and monitored the rocket right up to the last minute, and that's the two images that you see a little bit blurry here. Or other cameras were inserted into the body of the rocket to observe the fuel level, for instance. As a tool of monitoring and surveillance, television here functioned as a prosthetic media. It offered a necessary extension of vision for the NASA personnel while also protecting flight controllers from the dangerous launch. Its infrastructure was simultaneously extensive, covering the entire launch site, and restricted to the one site in Florida. Its images were fundamental to the broadcasting pictures that Engel describes as the supreme television event, but only addressed a small number of NASA employees who received the images via cable on dedicated screens. And as this last source from this first example shows, the CCTV monitors were themselves ubiquitous in the otherwise windowless control room. Added to the screenless consoles, the CCTV screens offered a multiplication of points of view that promised a totalizing gaze, all the while highlighting its necessarily fragmented character. I now move to my second example, and the question of simulation. Before the Saturn rocket could shoot astronauts to the moon, the astronauts had to master their vehicles and the various stages of the mission. This mastery was achieved by means of numerous simulators, which anticipated every conceivable procedure and eventuality of a manned lunar mission. NASA used simulation extensively throughout the 1960s and maintained an infrastructure of experimentation and training that benefited industrial, scientific, and military research alike. One of NASA's first major flight simulation projects, LOLA, the Lunar Orbit and Landing Simulator, was commissioned in 1965. The purpose of this simulator was to evaluate the procedures to be followed during the approach to the moon, considered to be one of the most critical moments of the lunar landing. LOLA combined 4 different scale models of the moon, a closed-circuit television system with a camera on a carriage that moved on rails, a cockpit with a control system connected to a central computer, and a projection screen for overhead projection of television images. As the apprentice astronaut navigated his dummy lunar module, the screen revealed an ever-expanding lunar landscape, simulating the approach to the moon that gave the simulator its name. In itself, the device resembled a television studio with its handcrafted decor and technical installations, painstakingly prepared by hand by NASA scientists turned decorators. However, Lola was not built for a TV audience, but for NASA's elite employees. We may thus ask, what does television produce in the simulator and what is its function? As in the previous example, televisual simulation created an environment that both protected and enhanced the human body. However, it did not so by bringing the camera close to the center of the danger, like the camera that was positioned near to the Saturn rocket, but by playing with the scales of a virtual landscape. Lola co-constructed an experience that had never been lived outside the device. In the mid-60s, human access to the lunar landscape remained a staged event confined to the laboratory. Consequently, then, the experience could not be separated from the televisual dispositif that made it possible. In Lola, the things studied and the media of study were identical. And my last example, television as data, emphasizes the importance of television for the management of communication between Earth and outer space, and highlights a moment when the television signal becomes raw data to be further processed. And to illustrate this point, I suggest moving to the NASA headquarters in Houston. The Houston Control Center was the heart, the lung, and certainly the brain of the Apollo mission, and the core of the agency's vast communication system, as you can see on this illustration. From Houston, NASA's data acquisition network was coordinated and managed by an army of employees and of computers of unprecedented computing power. Like the challenges it faced, the digital environment deployed in Houston surpassed all previous efforts. Indeed, real-time exchange of information was central to the Apollo mission, given the potentially catastrophic consequences of a failed manned space mission. However, information management not only required the latest generation of IBM computers, but also depended on many analog processes. And among all the analog technologies deployed, from pneumatic tubes to pen and paper, obviously, television occupied a special and central place. And to show you that, I would like to play a petit clip, s'il vous plaît, la petite vidéo, merci. So this is archival footage from the NASA collection. It has no sound, which allows me to continue talking a little bit. And so what you see is a view into the control room in Houston on the day of the Apollo 11 launch. And obviously what interests me here, are the flickering screens that you see all over, that are small as well as very large at the back of the room, and that literally jump at us, and that underline, of course, the presence of visual media in the control room. These monitors that we've just seen were connected to computers via closed-circuit television and offered the visual interface to the digital information processed and provided by the digital computers. Indeed, in the 1960s, computers did obviously not yet have screens as we know them today, and the junction between the analog world of users and the digital world of machines was achieved using pre-existing media, in particular TV. Within the control room architecture, television was, like the computer, a real-time medium. Embedded into the broad communications infrastructure, it participated in the synchronization of outer space and Earth. It simultaneously provided the information surface and the operational screen for mission control. As such, television, which was at the core of what NASA called the display and control system, constituted, and I quote, the man-machine interface for the mission flight controllers, and thus the binding link between calculated information and human operators. This real-time planetary communication was made possible thanks to the so-called Deep Space Network, still in use today for NASA missions. The Deep Space Network is a planetary scale infrastructure of antennas, satellites, senders, transmitters, etc., that assures the communication and information flow between outer space and control mission centers. And if we wish to define one single infrastructure of ubiquity, probably this would be it. The DSN was developed at the end of the 1950s by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory for US unmanned space missions. And unmanned space missions preceded and accompanied the manned Apollo missions. They allowed to test material and procedures and delivered important engineering and scientific data for the planning of future projects. Within the context of unmanned spaceflight, the communication network not only kept contact with the spacecraft, but had to make sure that the collected data and observation would return to Earth for analysis and research. While for manned space missions, such as the Apollo program, the return to Earth of the crew was obviously an indispensable feature of the mission's success, for unmanned space missions, the physical return of the spacecraft and its instruments was not necessary. The return of the data was the most important goal. The Ranger program, which was one of the early unmanned missions, active between 61 and 65, consisted of a series of 9 space probes launched to gather first close-up images of the moon, in order to determine future landing sites for Apollo. While the first 6 launches of Ranger were failures, Ranger 7 was finally successful in July 64. During 17 minutes, the 6 television cameras of Ranger 7 transmitted over 4,300 televisual images back to Earth. At the end of the 17 minutes, the camera not simply shut down, but Ranger 7 crashed into the lunar surface while transmitting the last picture. Similarly to a kamikaze drone, for Ranger 7, fulfilling the mission meant self-destruction. Within this context, the affordances of TV as a live and transmission media were central. Its analog electronic nature, the fact that the image is written point by point and line by line as an electromagnetic signal, represented an essential advantage over other imagining technologies of the time, and in particular over photography. In addition, RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, that collaborated with NASA for the construction of these imaging systems, already had extensive experience with television used precisely for drone warfare and guided missile systems. The conceptual framing of television's use in a space probe that crashes into its target in order to shoot it was similar to the understanding of early drones, which transmitted television images of their target approach before crashing into the target. Given the features of the Ranger images, their blurriness, their limited angle and point of view, and overall rather low quality, it is not surprising that these close-ups of lunar landscapes have left very few traces in collective memory. As much as these images represent the moon, they emphasize the technical difficulties of remote viewing. Importantly, and this is my last point, these images were not finished once they arrived on the screens of NASA experts. On the receiver end, the images were again integrated into a broad infrastructure of analog and digital technologies and were further processed. First, in order to keep the visual trace of moon surfaces, the video transmissions were recorded on 35mm film and on magnetic tape recorders. Second, in order to optimize the results of the television transmissions, the television images were translated into computer language. So I read this quote: the pictures were digitized, translated into computer language in which something is either exactly something or exactly something else. The TV images, formerly a row of lines, were converted to a fine checkerboard. At the same time, the smooth spectrum of gray was reduced to 64 shades between black and white. Then the computer searched for recognizable noise patterns and removed them. The contrast could also be enhanced by the computer. In addition to analog image processing that recorded the television images on lasting supports, the signals from outer space thus also underwent digital image processing that allowed to enhance their overall quality and improve their usability for further research. Digital processing of these images was supported by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that developed the algorithms for basic operations such as geometrical corrections and noise cancelling, which would become obviously standard procedures well beyond space science. And I just show you two examples very quickly. So on the left, the same image before and after digitization, and then before the treatment, like the noise cancelling that gives, or it's more the bringing to the fore the noise that can then be cancelled to produce the fourth image, which is like the digital enhanced image. And on the right, it's about the geometric distortion due to the angle that the television camera actually pointed at on the moon's surface. And so with this digitization and algorithmic processing, the image could be moved back to the right angle. And I actually won't go into that because I also think that Brooke will talk a little bit about that. Yes, perfect. I'm really at my conclusion here. So going back to my starting point and the moon landing in '69, my speedy overview of television at NASA highlights the materiality of remote viewing, its infrastructures, and the literal constructedness. The production of remote seeing was the result of material, scientific, and engineering efforts brought together to produce specific kinds of information. Television's affordance as a technology of ubiquity was reconfigured numerous times on various scales and reinterpreted in accordance with particular problems of the mission. Be it through the multiplication of screens, the televisual simulation of outer space, or the telecommunication with space probes, televisual remote viewing served specific mission goals before, during, and after the rocket launch. Television's expansionist character, highlighted by Lawrence Engel at the beginning, was not restricted to the broadcast of '69, but co-constructed visual knowledge throughout the 1960s. Television was not only a mass media, but very much also a useful tool. As a useful media, television offered the interface between man and digital machines. Combined with computers, it constituted the communication surface for NASA operators in the control room. Television was therefore instrumental to the visualization of digital data. Television turned into data was also crucial for the emergence of digital processing tools and algorithmically enhanced visualizations. In short, if we follow the television signal from the Earth to the Moon and back, we therefore not only discover multiple views of planetary scale, but touch upon a media archaeology of the digital, its screens and image processing algorithms in which TV as an electronic analog technology plays a central role. Thank you.